The acid rain of Miami fell mercilessly against the armored glass of the black limousine, warping the Christmas lights of Faria Lima Avenue into lifeless neon smears. Pedro, wearing his cold Italian wool suit that cost more than most of his employees earned in a year, checked the market's closing charts on his tablet, ignoring the damp chaos outside. The silence inside the vehicle was absolute. An acoustic isolation that perfectly mirrored the emotional vacuum he had cultivated over 5 decades. A relentless ascent to the top of the corporate pyramid. To him, the outside world was merely a noisy, inefficient cog to be managed, never felt or understood beyond metrics of profit and productivity. As he stepped out beneath the marble canopy of his 800-square-meter penthouse, Pedro's abrupt movement nearly trampled a small, huddled figure on the granite floor. There, under the cold glow of the security spotlights, was Leo, a boy of only 9 years old, wearing a grey hoodie 3, sizes too big for his frail body, stained with the soot of the metropolis. The boy did not extend his hand to beg for coins, nor did he display the cardboard sign of hunger that Pedro was used to systematically ignoring. Instead, Leo used his slender body as a human shield, crouched over the sidewalk to protect a drawing made with colored chalk that the downpour was beginning to devour. The contrast was violent and almost obscene. The billionaire CEO, whose designer leather shoes were worth a fortune, facing a child whose only possessions were pieces of chalk and the hope of saving an ephemeral image. Pedro felt an initial irritation, the reflex of someone who detests interruptions to his meticulously controlled routine. But something in the boy's posture stopped him before he called private security. Leo did not look at Pedro with fear or submission. His brown eyes, deep and heavy with an ancestral melancholy, were fixed on the water washing away the blue and yellow of a house drawn. On the ground, it was the image of absolute loss, unfolding in absolute silence, right at the feet of a man who believed he owned everything. At the exact moment Pedro opened his mouth to order the boy to leave, Leo lifted his dust-streaked face and asked a question that sliced through the air like a stiletto. "Do you know where the colors go when the rain comes?" The sentence, laden with tragic innocence, echoed through the monumental hall, disarming the businessman's defensive protocols. Pedro watched the chalk melt and form a grey puddle, just like the memories of his own poor childhood that he had spent decades trying to bury beneath layers of concrete and ego. Not knowing how to react, Pedro felt, for the first time in 30 years, the unbearable weight of his own loneliness reflected in the desperate purity of that small stranger. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. The silence that followed Leo's question was filled only by the rhythmic sound of rain striking the metal of the parked luxury cars. Pedro felt a physical discomfort, a tightness in his chest that medicine could not explain, but that his memory recognized as the ghost of an old hunger. He looked at the drawing, now dissolved, and on an impulse that defied his crisis management logic, extended his hand to the boy, gesturing toward the cafe attached to the building that still kept its lights on. The on-duty security guard made a move to intervene, but a cold glance from Pedro froze him in place, signaling that the rules had changed on that December night. Inside the establishment, the contrast between the leather upholstery and Leo's grimy clothes was stark, yet the boy seemed far more concerned with the chalk left in his pocket than with the luxury around him. As Leo devoured a grilled roll and a cup of hot chocolate with silent urgency, Pedro watched the boy's small, calloused hands. Those hands carried him back to 1978, to a forgotten outskirts, where he himself had drawn on the ground to forget the ache in his stomach. He remembered his mother, who worked 3 jobs and barely had time to give him a hug, leaving him to his own devices on streets as cruel as these. The coldness Pedro used to close multi-billion-dollar deals was, in truth, a hardened scar from a boy who learned too early that the world offers no free shelter. Watching Leo eat with such gratitude for something so insignificant made Pedro's billions seem like useless papers stacked inside an empty safe. Leo began to talk between bites, explaining that he lived in a temporary shelter until he was sent back to the streets due to a lack of space, but that he still held on to the hope that his mother would return. He said he drew families on the sidewalk because he believed that if he made a house beautiful and colorful enough, she would be able to find him through the glow of chalk in the dark. Pedro listened to every word with an attention he rarely gave his executive directors, feeling a dangerous connection form between his arid soul and that resilient child. The boy possessed an unshakable purity, an ability to see colors where Pedro saw only gray, and that was beginning to crack the armor the businessman had spent decades building. Leo's vulnerability was not a weakness in Pedro's eyes, but a strength he himself had lost on the road to success. At the end of the snack, Pedro glanced at the luxury watch on his wrist. But for the first time, time did not mean money. It meant a moral decision he was not ready to make. He could not simply hand over 100-real bill and send the boy back into the storm, raging beyond the glass. Just for tonight, he told himself silently, trying to justify the madness of bringing a stranger into his private sanctuary of glass and steel. Leo took Pedro's hand with a trust the businessman had not received from anyone in years. A small, warm hand that contrasted with the cold of that indifferent metropolis. In the private elevator, their reflection in the mirror showed the giant of the financial market and the small street artist joined by an invisible thread of mutual need. The penthouse, which had once seemed a monument to sophistication, suddenly felt sterile and lifeless under Leo's curious gaze as he touched the expensive sculptures with reverence. Pedro felt a twinge of shame at the excessive opulence of his living room, where each painting was worth more than the shelter where the boy spent his nights. He arranged clean clothes, a branded t-shirt that fit Leo like a dress, and prepared the guest room that had gone unused for 5 years of residence. The boy looked at the king-size bed as if it were an altar, afraid to disturb the perfection of the 1,000-thread-count sheets with a body still marked by the streets. Pedro, leaning against the doorframe, felt the weight of the silence of his life replaced by the gentle sound of another person breathing. Vicky. Following morning, the outside world demanded its toll in the form of incessant notifications on Pedro's phone and urgent calls from his board of directors. News that the ruthless CEO had been seen sheltering a street boy began circulating behind the scenes, fueling rumors that he was losing the lucidity required for the role. His partners sent veiled messages, questioning whether he was still fit to lead the multi-billion-dollar merger with an Asian group scheduled for that week. Pedro ignored them all, focused instead on watching Leo, who was now drawing on heavy, high-quality paper Pedro had found in his office, using professional design pens. The office, once a place of aggressive strategies, had turned into an improvised studio where a child's imagination challenged the logic of numbers and profit spreadsheets. State bureaucracy was quick to knock on the door, embodied by a stern social worker who had been alerted by the building's security about the presence of an unidentified minor. Pedro, accustomed to bending governments and laws for the benefit of his company, felt powerless in the face of child protection regulations that required Leo's immediate referral to an institution. He argued, offered donations, leveraged his prestige, but the law was clear. Leo had no documents, no ties, and Pedro was a stranger with no legal relationship. The fear of losing the boy awakened a protective instinct Pedro didn't know he possessed, a will to fight that went beyond any market dispute. Sensing the tension, Leo simply pressed a drawing of a house against his chest, afraid that his small refuge of luxury was about to collapse. In the days that followed, Pedro began neglecting board meetings, spending hours on the phone with family law attorneys, trying to find a legal loophole to keep Leo close. He discovered that bureaucracy was a labyrinth of slow, cold processes designed to handle registration numbers, not to save souls starved for affection. External pressure mounted. His company's shares dipped slightly amid uncertainty about his leadership, and business newspapers began publishing ironic notes about his midlife crisis. Pedro, however, barely read the news. His mind was far too busy learning the names of Leo's favorite colors and understanding the traumas the boy carried. Each bureaucratic obstacle only seemed to strengthen Pedro's resolve not to let the child be swallowed again by the city's impersonal system. The bond between them deepened through brief but meaningful conversations during dinners that now had the sound of voices, not just cutlery. Leo asked Pedro why he didn't have children, and the answer stuck in the throat of a man who had always prioritized financial statements over emotions. Pedro realized that his fortune was a high wall he had built to protect himself from suffering as his mother had suffered, but one that also kept him from loving. He confessed to the boy that he was afraid of failing, of not being the safe harbor someone needed, while Leo simply smiled and said that anyone who draws houses knows the foundation is what no one sees. That simple, disarming wisdom made Pedro question every value that had guided his life up to that moment of painful epiphany. The tension reached its peak when the board of directors called an emergency meeting to vote on Pedro's removal from the presidency, citing erratic behavior and damage to the brand's image. At the same time, the social worker returned with a court order for removal, ready to take Leo to an institutional shelter in another city, far from any influence Pedro might have. The businessman found himself between a rock and a hard place. Fight for his multi-billion-dollar empire, or fight for a boy he had met on a rainy sidewalk less than 2 weeks earlier? The fear of becoming the nobody of his childhood screamed in his mind, but the look of panic in Leo's eyes as he saw the state agents was an even louder cry. Pedro felt the ground beneath, his marble floors giving way, forcing him to choose between what he had and who he wanted to be. Pedro's inner conflict manifested in sleepless nights, wandering the penthouse and gazing at the city lights he had helped build, feeling like a foreigner in his own kingdom. He saw Leo's drawings scattered across the glass coffee table, vibrant representations of joy that contrasted with the black and white photographs of his own solitary trajectory. The idea that Leo could be sent somewhere he would become just another number in the system was unbearable to the man who now saw in the boy a chance to redeem his own past. Pedro realized that true wealth was not the power to buy companies, but the power to change the destiny of a human life that fate had placed in his path. He was willing to burn every corporate bridge if it meant saving the only emotional bridge left in his life. On the morning before the major merger meeting, the atmosphere in the penthouse was one of calm before the storm, with Leo visibly paler and more exhausted from the stress of the past few days. Pedro tried to maintain an appearance of control, but his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, a sign that the armor was finally crumbling. He knew the coming hours would define the rest of his existence, not by the value of shares on the stock exchange, but by the value of his word and his heart. Looking at Leo, asleep on the sofa clutching a case of new chalks, Pedro made a silent decision that would change everything the financial world thought about him. The journey from a cold CEO to a protective father was about to face its most difficult and definitive test, amid the chill of the law and the warmth of an unexpected bond. The crisis reached its breaking point when Leo, weakened by stress and the cold he had endured on the streets, collapsed onto the Persian rug in the living room with a fever nearing 40 degrees Celsius. Instead of heading to the merger meeting where billions were at stake, Pedro carried the boy in his arms to the hospital, ignoring the frantic calls from his partners demanding his immediate presence. In the antiseptic corridor of the intensive care unit, the most powerful man in the technology sector seemed small and fragile, sitting on a plastic chair as he waited for news about the pneumonia that now threatened Leo's life. The social worker and the company's lawyers surrounded him, but Pedro no longer heard legal terms or reputational risks. He could focus only on the sight of Leo's small chest struggling to breathe beneath the white sheets. It was in that forced isolation that Pedro realized his fortune was a sandcastle compared to the possibility of losing the boy who had given him back the ability to feel. Hours later, when Leo briefly regained consciousness, he extended a trembling hand toward Pedro and handed him a crumpled piece of paper he had kept in the pocket of his oversized coat. It was a new drawing, but this time there were no houses or chalk melted by the rain. It was a portrait of Pedro, drawn with simple lines, yet bearing a smile the businessman had not recognized in himself for decades. In the drawing, Leo and Pedro were holding hands atop a building that shone as if made of sunlight, and beneath it was written in childlike letters, "My safe harbor." The emotional impact of those words was greater than any corporate victory, causing Pedro's heart, hardened by years of cynicism, to finally shatter into 1,000 pieces of pure humanity. Tears, held back through a lifetime of pride and repression, streamed down the CEO's face, staining the paper he now held as if it were the most valuable document in his vast investment portfolio. The climax reached its highest note when the chairman of the board entered the hospital, accompanied by security guards, demanding that Pedro sign the merger documents or face immediate removal for neglecting shareholders' interests. Pedro rose from the chair, not with the aggression of a market predator, but with the dignity of a man who had found his true purpose amid chaos. He looked his former ally in the eye and, in a calm yet cutting voice, declared that his resignation was signed and that the board could keep control of the company because he had more important business to attend to. "You negotiate numbers. I am negotiating a life," Pedro said, as stunned silence filled the corridor, sealing his definitive exit from the world he had helped build but no longer inhabited. The transformation was complete. The man who lived for financial assets was now willing to give up everything for a liability the system considered disposable. The next scene was a whispered, transformative dialogue at the bedside, where Pedro held Leo's hand and promised, not as a benefactor but as a father, that the boy would never again draw alone on a rainy sidewalk. He explained that bureaucracy no longer mattered because he would use every remaining resource to ensure that they would be, legally and in their hearts, a family forever. Leo, his eyes shining despite the exhaustion of illness, asked if that meant Pedro would be his color that never fades, and Pedro, his voice breaking, confirmed it with a nod. The cold hospital room was filled with a human warmth no technology or material wealth could replicate, marking the birth of a bond that defied social statistics and class prejudice. The ruthless businessman died there, giving way to a man who understood that the greatest acquisition of his life had not been a company, but the love of an orphan. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's continue with the video. The story's resolution took shape 6 months later, when the autumn sun illuminated the new headquarters of the Aquarella Foundation, an institution Pedro founded after selling his majority stake in the multinational corporation. The building, once a grey, abandoned industrial warehouse, now displayed massive, colorful murals, serving as a center of care and the arts for hundreds of children who, like Leo, lived on the margins of society. Pedro traded his gray suits for casual clothes and a demeanor that radiated a peace unknown in his days as a CEO, dedicating his time to managing what he called human profit. The adoption paperwork had finally been completed, and Leo's name now bore Pedro's surname, legally sealing what the heart had already made official on that stormy night. The luxury penthouse was renovated to include a painting studio and rooms full of life, ceasing to be a museum of solitude and becoming a true home. Their lives changed in concrete and profound ways, establishing a routine in which breakfast was filled with drawing plans and social projects instead of stock market quotes. Pedro used his strategic mind to create a model of assistance that not only provided food and shelter, but restored dignity and identity to the metropolis's invisible children. Leo, now recovered and attending an art school, became a living symbol that investing in affection yields incalculable returns for society. Pedro's reconciliation with his own past finally allowed him to forgive the poor boy he once was, healing his wounds through caring for others. The city, once seen as a monster of steel and glass, was now viewed by them as a vast garden of opportunities where every seed of kindness could bloom. Their vision of the future was now one of hope and continuity, with Pedro teaching Leo that a man's true power lies in his ability to protect the most vulnerable. They traveled together to inaugurate new units of the foundation, spreading the message that no child should have their dreams washed away by the rain of indifference. The existential void Pedro once felt was filled with laughter, paint-stained hands, and the gratitude of watching Leo grow with health and emotional security. The protagonist's transformation was so radical that his former partners barely recognized him, yet Pedro had never been more confident in his decisions or more proud of his journey. Material wealth became merely a tool, a means to a far greater end, the construction of a legacy of love that would endure far beyond any quarterly financial statement. The cycle of pain was definitively broken, giving rise to a narrative of redemption that inspired other business leaders to look beyond their individual profits. The moral of the story became clear to everyone around them. True success is not measured by what we accumulate in our bank accounts, but by the number of lives we manage to illuminate with our presence. Pedro discovered that happiness was not at the top of the skyscraper, isolated from the world, but on the sidewalk, hand in hand with a boy who taught him the value of colors. Life, once a cold, straight line of productivity, became a vibrant and complex drawing, where each new color represented a gesture of humanity. They were no longer two strangers united by chance, but a family forged by the conscious choice that loving is, indeed, the most profitable investment a human being can make. 15 years passed, and the scene is now the inauguration of the Esperanza residential building, a socially driven architectural project internationally awarded for its sustainability and dignity. On the stage, a young man with an elegant presence and bright eyes adjusts the microphone to address the crowd and the families who would receive their keys that morning. It is Leo, now a renowned architect, who has dedicated his career to transforming low-income housing into functional works of art for those the system usually forgets. In the front row, Pedro, his hair now completely white and a smile of unshakable pride on his face, watches his son with tear-filled eyes. The circle closes perfectly when Leo ends his emotional speech, looking directly at his father and saying for all to hear, "I was just a drawing washed away by the rain on the sidewalk until someone decided to give me the chalk and teach me that I could color my own destiny." Have you ever done an act of kindness that changed a life? Comment, "Love has no price," if you also believe in human kindness. Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more stories of second chances.